So in supplemental feeding, usually intake is the limiting factor associated with these deficiencies in dormant or poor quality hay. Dormant forages or poor quality hay. And so when that protein content gets below that 7, just a little bit of extra high protein supplement will really get things in balance and increase our intake there. So if that forage, and whether it be grass or hay, contains less than 7%, feeding that protein supplement, maybe a higher protein, 40% crude protein supplement, will improve both the protein and energy status of the cattle by improving digestibility and ultimately increasing the intake of that forage so we can get them back in balance there. The key thing is when utilizing more of a high protein supplement in this kind of strategy, you got to have adequate forage necessary, because if not, that excess protein that you're giving those cattle to try to meet the energy needs of them will be converted to energy, but it's a very expensive source. It's not very efficient there. And so you got to regroup and explore some other alternatives to meet the energy requirements, and probably move on to the next strategy that we have when we're talking about supplemental strategies is enhancement feeding. And so with that, we're adding to the value of low quality forage to increase the diet value. So whereas before we were only providing maybe 2-3 pounds of a supplement that was high in protein, now we're providing several pounds of a supplement, or maybe replacing half the forage in the diet with a supplement that's more moderate in protein and higher in energy there. And you can see in this slide we went from about 80% of our intake, and we bumped it up because we've increased intake of the forage, but we also saw a really big increase in the protein and energy status of that animal based off the supplement there. Okay, so a little bit different strategy here. And so when we're thinking about enhancement feeding, we got real poor quality hay that either on dry or wet cows below that 6% protein, you may have to be feeding somewhere in that 5 to 10 pounds of a moderate protein, higher energy supplement. Feeding medium quality hay to lactating cows, so some hay that's maybe in that 7 to 8% protein, that to some cows that are in borderline condition or maybe poor condition, you're going to have to feed a more of a moderate protein supplement. Maybe a 20% breeder's cube is an option there. If you got to increase the body condition of thin cows over maybe a shorter period of time, you're going to be feeding more of that. If forage is limited or forage is expensive, like we talked about earlier, it may be a better strategy to minimize forage intake or reduce forage intake and replace it with some more economical source of protein energy, which could be a grain-based source there. So those are some enhancement feeding strategies that we can utilize. All right, we've talked about different supplementation strategies. We had enhancement feeding and supplemental feeding there. Now let's kind of get down to, how do I know what to supplement with, or how much do I supplement with? And it goes back to just some basic requirements of the cow. Now there are some programs out there. Oklahoma State's got several different programs that are Excel-based that are very simple. They've got some feed libraries, and you can actually alter those libraries as well, and I use those quite often when I'm trying to work with ranchers to figure out some supplemental strategies. So those work exceptionally well. Another way is just to kind of get a ballpark figure of what those cows are eating, and then figure out what they're deficient in, and then you can kind of make some adjustments based off a body condition score. But regardless of whether you're using a computer program or whether you're kind of just doing a wild guess there in the amount that's needed, you still need to monitor body condition. You still need to look at the manure piles to figure out, well, is my intake a little off, or some of my assumptions off there. So we're going to just go through real quickly a couple of slides to look at what are some basic nutrient requirements of a late gestation cow. of various different weights, and we go from 1,100 to 1,400 pounds, and you can see the bigger the cow, the greater the intake is expected because it's off a percentage of body weight. Protein requirements go from 1.6 to 1.9, and then our energy requirements go from 11 to 13 pounds of energy there. As we get into an early lactation, as we expected, as we looked at some of the earlier slides, we showed and when she starts lactation, requirements are going to go up. And so as you can see, with an 1,100 pound cow, intake was 22.3. We were about 1.5 pounds more than what we were prior to calving. And then proteins, 2.6 pounds. As we get up to that 1,400 pound cow, we're at 26 pounds of dry matter intake, almost 3 pounds of protein, and 16.5 pounds of energy there. So that gives you some ballparks and some things to work. So let's feed some cows. So if I've got an 1,100 pound dry cow, she doesn't need to gain but maybe about a pound per day. And so if we figure that based off of that chart, we could see that she's going to need about 1.6 pounds of protein and 11 pounds of energy. If our hay is 8% protein and 52% TDN, she'll eat about 22 pounds of hay per day. And so with that, if we multiply 8% times 22, that's about 1.7 pounds of protein that she'll get per day from the hay. The TDN, 52% times 22, we're at about 11.4 pounds. So we have met her requirements based off of the hay quality that we had and the assumptions of what she was going to eat. Again, that's pretty crude, but again, when most producers in cattle that are grazing or eating forage, we're going to have to do some assumptions, and we've got to actually do some modifications on the fly at times and monitor body condition score and change the strategies as necessary with that. Wanted to show you the value of forage quality and really the value of forage testing. If you don't test your hay, have any idea what quality is, you're probably either going to be underfeeding or overfeeding those cattle. And so just some examples of some hay that I pulled off from samples that were tested here in the state of Texas. There's a Bermuda grass hay that was 13% protein, 58% TDN. As you could see, we assumed that we had an 1,100 pound cow mid-gestation, and we're feeding that to her. She could eat more than 18 pounds a day, but at 18 pounds she met her requirements there. The Jigs hay is a little lower quality, but still about 18 pounds per day. Peanut hay, and let's move on down to, we get to that Milo hay, or sometimes we call Milo stubble. The crude protein was 6%, the TDN was 45%. It would require about 6 pounds of a 20% cube to meet the needs of that cow, or about $1.14 per day in just supplemental feeding cost. And you can see as we get into the rice hay, there was about 75 cents and $1.29 cost of supplement per day. Now, some people say that you need to just feed high quality forage. Well, you need to feed them a forage that they will eat, but if it's a lower quality forage that you're going to have to supplement with, if you can get it for the right price, and when you put the supplement cost with it, at the end of the day, it comes down to what it costs you to feed that cow per day in a combination of the forage as well as the supplement. And so sometimes it may be cheaper to purchase that lower quality hay if you can get your supplemental costs down, and it may be cheaper in the long run versus feeding a really high quality, maybe a 12 or 13% hay that's 58% TDN. If it's costing you $120, $130 a ton for that hay, you may be better off with something that's down to maybe that $50 a ton or $60 a ton, and providing some additional supplement with it there. So some things to think about there. So what supplement do I use? There's lots of different supplements out there. And like we just discussed, maybe good quality hay is the best. If I can produce it and put it up cheap enough to where my cost per day is going to be less expensive versus putting up more of a lower quality hay and having to supplement with a protein and energy source. Lots of different supplements out there. Could be some byproducts or co-products, and that could be whole cottonseed or distiller's grains, gin trash. There's all kinds of different products out there that producers will feed. Bakery waste, lots of different things that are options to supplement cattle with. It could be cottonseed meal, soybean meal, grain or combination of corn and soybean meal or cottonseed meal. It could be a cube, a liquid feed, or protein blocks. So there's lots of options. Now, if we take just the white there on that slide, we go from byproducts to protein. Typically, on a pound of nutrient basis, the byproducts or co-products are going to be the cheapest. The protein blocks are going to be the most expensive because there's more processing as you move down that slide. Now, from a convenience factor, you can flip it. On your byproducts, you're going to have to handle that differently. So if you're a small operator and you don't have the economies of scale to handle it, there may be more labor costs to fork whole cottonseed, okay? Or if you're big enough and you've got a commodity barn and you've got a mixer wagon, the cheaper price of it, you can offset some of the labor costs and those types of things. The protein blocks are going to be very convenient. Liquid's going to be convenient. But there's more processing in those protein blocks, and so you're going to have to pay for that convenience factor. So at the end of the day, which one is the best? We just need to figure out what those animals need in the form of nutrients. And then you decide, well, which one's the most economical and the most convenient for my particular operation. And what your neighbor may be able to do, it may be different than what you will be able to do. And so it just depends with that. Some things about cutting supplemental cost. We've talked about this a little bit in class already. Maybe targeting when you're calving to whenever you're going to have some of your higher nutrient requirements. So if you can match the peak of lactation when maybe we're going into the spring and we've got a flush of green grass and we'll have that all the way up into midsummer, that may be a great time, and that works very well in the south. So some things to think about versus if you're into a fall calving season, you're probably going to be having to feed additional forage and supplement through most of the lactation of that particular cow. So your feeding costs are going to be higher. Now granted, because more producers calve their cows out in the spring and less in the fall, typically calf prices are going to decline as we get into the fall when most of those cows, the calves are being weaned off of them, and they'll be higher in the spring. So there are some differences in marketing there as well. Other ways to cut cost without sacrificing performance, appropriate stocking rates. So you're not having to feed stored forage for an extended period of time. Winter pasture in the south and southeast, we rely on a lot of our winter pasture, especially when we get into some ryegrass and some of our legumes. And maybe stockpiled forage. If you're in an area like you can see today, we're on kind of a hillside, it's well drained. Rather than taking a last cutting of hay, we take and we turn those cows in on it as we get into the winter months and use it as more of a stockpiled hay rather than paying the cost of putting it up, storing it, and then having to turn around and feed it again. You don't have to feed every day, and most producers, if they're feeding somewhere in that no more than probably 4 to 5, maybe 6 pounds per day of a supplement, they're going to be feeding that every other day. And so you don't have to feed those cows every day. Use a high crude protein supplement. If the intake is more of the limiting factor and you don't have a real low quality forage, maybe a 40% protein supplement. Just a little bit of that may be a better strategy. Calculate the cost per pound of crude protein and whatever it may be. Oftentimes the cheapest supplement may not be the cheapest in the long run when you figure out what it's costing you for those nutrients. Avoid the bag if you can buy in bulk. And bulk commodities, you're going to cheapen it up a little bit. Even if you don't have ways to feed those bulk commodities, we see more and more producers using big commodity bags and putting those into some portable feeders. Co-products or byproducts of other industries, food industries, work exceptionally well, and they can reduce some of the costs into it as well. Now, we won't get to go into, because of time, get into a really in-depth discussion on mineral supplementation, but mineral supplementation is extremely important. And one of the resources that we have for this class that I encourage you to go in and review is the mineral supplementation in Texas publication that we'll have as a resource.